The freezing air inside the cardiac ICU wrapped around me like a second skin, cold and unforgiving. It felt even sharper than the bitter November wind I had walked through 6 weeks earlier, back when this nightmare first began. Everything around me felt painfully sterile. The bright white lights above buzzed softly. The constant beeping of machines reminded me that my heart was still fighting, even when I wasn't sure I had the strength to. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled my nose, mixed with a metallic scent of blood lingering from the 4-line attached to my arm. At the foot of my hospital bed stood a woman in pale blue scrubs. She held a clipboard tightly against her chest, almost like it was protecting her from what she had to say. Her face looked tense, and she avoided looking directly into my eyes. That small detail alone made my stomach tighten with fear. I had seen that look before. It was the look people wore when bad news had already been decided, when your future had been discussed behind closed doors, and you were simply the last person to be informed. The room suddenly felt even colder. I shifted slightly against the stiff hospital sheets, my body weak from exhaustion, pain, and the endless tests that had become my daily reality. My chest still ached deeply, every breath reminding me that my heart was failing me more with each passing day. For weeks, I had been holding on, through appointments, terrifying diagnoses, insurance paperwork, and my husband's constant promises that he was handling everything. He had told me not to worry. He had said he was securing the loan. He had promised me I would get the surgery I needed. But as I looked at the nurse standing there, unable to meet my gaze, a heavy sense of dread settled into my bones. Something was wrong. Something had changed. "Mrs. Calloway," she finally said. Her voice was soft, too soft. It was the kind of voice people use when delivering condolences, not medical updates. The kind of voice that prepares you for devastation before the actual words even arrive. My fingers tightened weakly around the thin hospital blanket. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. For a moment she hesitated, as if she wished she could be anywhere else in the world but standing in front of me. And in that terrible silence, I realized the worst part wasn't just the fear. It was knowing that whatever came next had already been decided. Without me. "Your insurance claim has been denied." The nurse's words hit me harder than the pain in my chest. She paused for a moment, as if giving me time to process what she had just said. But there was no way anyone could truly prepare for words like that. "The primary policyholder cancelled your coverage 48 hours ago," she continued carefully. "Unless we receive payment or a valid replacement policy by tomorrow evening, the hospital will have to transfer you to county care for the rest of your recovery." I just stared at her. For a moment I couldn't breathe, not because of my damaged heart, but because my mind simply refused to understand. The steady beeping of the monitors around me continued, cold and mechanical, marking each passing second with cruel precision. Each beep was a reminder that I was still alive. But everything I thought I knew about my life was falling apart. 6 weeks earlier, my world had been completely different. I had been 31 years old, an elementary school art teacher in Portland, Oregon. My days had been filled with finger paints, construction paper, and the laughter of children proudly showing me their crooked watercolor masterpieces. My biggest worries had been lesson plans, grocery lists, and whether my husband would remember to pick up milk on his way home. I had been happily married, or so I thought. For 4 years I had believed Daniel Calloway was my partner, my protector, my safest place in the world. He had been charming, dependable, and attentive. The kind of man who held doors open, remembered birthdays, and kissed my forehead when I was stressed. At least that's who I thought he was. Now I was lying in a hospital bed with a fresh scar running down the center of my chest, a brutal reminder of the emergency surgery that had saved my life after what doctors called a sudden cardiac event of unclear origin. One day, I had been teaching a classroom full of second graders how to mix colors. The next I had collapsed. And suddenly, my entire life had become tests, scans, oxygen tubes, and terrifying conversations whispered outside my hospital room. Through it all, Daniel had promised me everything would be okay. He had squeezed my hand before surgery, looked me in the eyes, and told me not to worry. He said he was going to the bank to secure a home equity loan to cover whatever insurance wouldn't. He promised he'd be back before I woke up. But he never returned. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Traffic, paperwork delays, a dead phone battery, anything. But as hours turned into a full day, and then more, excuses became impossible. He was gone. And now, according to the nurse standing before me, he hadn't just disappeared. He had actively cancelled my insurance while I was preparing for open-heart surgery. "There has to be some mistake," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Even saying the words felt hollow. "My husband. Daniel, he wouldn't do that." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "He's my emergency contact. He signed all the consent forms. He was here." The nurse's expression shifted, her professionalism barely masking her pity. She slowly lowered the clipboard, and somehow that small movement made everything feel even worse. Because pity meant this wasn't confusion. Meant this was real. "Mrs. Calloway," she said softly, her voice filled with heartbreaking sympathy. "I'm so sorry." And in that moment, I realized something far more terrifying than my surgery itself. My heart may have survived, but my marriage had not. "I've been a nurse for 22 years, she said quietly, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had delivered too much heartbreak over the course of her career. "And I truly hate being the one who has to tell patients things like this." She looked down for a moment, gathering herself before continuing. "But the billing office has called the emergency contact number on file 11 times over the past 2 days. Her words were careful, professional, but each one felt like another crack spreading through what was left of my world. "Every single call has gone to voicemail." I stared at her, barely blinking. Then she added something that shattered me even more. "A woman answered once." I felt my entire body go still. The room didn't spin. There was no dramatic gasp. Just a slow, crushing collapse somewhere deep inside me. The nurse's voice softened further. She said, "You were no longer Mr. Calloway's concern, woman." Those 2 words hit harder than the scalpel that had split my chest open. They landed directly beneath my ribs, in the exact place surgeons had just fought to repair. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even fully breathe. I closed my eyes, desperate to shut out the fluorescent lights, the machines, the pity in her expression. And behind my eyelids, the last 6 months of my life began replaying themselves like a cruel film I had never properly understood until now. Daniel working late. Again. And again. Daniel keeping his phone face down during dinner. Daniel stepping outside to take business calls. Daniel brushing off my growing exhaustion. My chest pains. My dizziness. The fluttering in my heart that sometimes left me gripping the kitchen counter just to stay standing. "You're stressed, Claire," he would say with that calm, reassuring smile I trusted so completely. "You're overworking. It's anxiety. You need rest. You really should stop drinking so much coffee." And every night, every single night, he brought me tea. Warm lemon ginger tea in my favorite ceramic mug. He'd hand it to me with gentle hands, kiss my forehead, and tell me he just wanted his wife to feel better. My stomach twisted violently. Because now, lying in that hospital bed, I could suddenly remember something I hadn't wanted to notice before. The bitterness beneath the ginger. The strange heaviness that followed. How I often felt unusually sleepy afterward. How my symptoms had worsened over time. How I had trusted him. Over and over again. Telling me. Comforting me. Watching me weaken. I opened my eyes slowly. My voice barely above a whisper. What did the doctors say caused this? The question felt heavier than anything I'd ever asked. The cardiac event. I swallowed painfully. Did they figure it out yet? For the first time the nurse hesitated. And that hesitation terrified me more than any answer could have. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "Dr. Reyes wanted to speak with you himself." My pulse monitor quickened slightly. "The toxicology panel from your admission came back this morning." Toxicology panel. The words didn't fully register at first. But when they did, I spread through my veins. She gave me a long, measured look, as if she wanted to say more, but couldn't, or wouldn't. "He'll be here shortly," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "Please try to rest, Mrs. Calloway. Don't strain yourself. Rest." As if rest were possible now. As if my entire reality hadn't just been ripped apart. She turned and quietly left the room. And for a long time I was alone. Alone with the endless beeping of machines. Alone with the sterile smell of disinfectant. Alone with the unbearable sound of my own heart beating inside my chest. A heart that had nearly been destroyed. A heart that was now beginning to understand it may not have failed naturally at all. Each beat felt accusatory, heavy, unnatural. Like my own body was mourning the truth before my mind could catch up. I should tell you something now, before this story goes any further. My name is Claire. Claire Ellen Calloway. Formerly Claire Ellen Whitfield. And if you had asked me 6 weeks ago who I was, I would have told you something painfully ordinary. I would have said I was nobody special. Just a woman who had survived a hard childhood. An orphan raised in the foster care system outside Eugene, Oregon. A quiet girl who learned early not to expect permanence from anyone. I bounced between homes, caseworkers, and temporary families until I aged out of the system carrying little more than survival instincts and stubborn determination. I earned a community college scholarship through sheer persistence. Transferred to Portland State. Earned my degree in art education. Built a simple life. Safe life. I became an elementary school art teacher because helping children create beauty from chaos felt meaningful to me. Felt like healing. And then I met Daniel. He walked into the coffee shop where I worked weekends to pay off student loans. He was charming, Polish, warm. He smiled at me like I mattered. And one rainy Portland afternoon, he told me my smile looked like the first sunny day after a Portland winter. 'Twas corny. But I fell for it anyway. For him anyway. By 27 I married him. And I believed, with every fragile part of my once lonely heart, that I had finally found my forever family. I had no living relatives. No inheritance. No powerful connections. No dramatic past worth telling. No reason to believe anyone would ever target me for anything. I thought I was just Claire. Ordinary Claire. But as I lay there recovering from open-heart surgery, abandoned by my husband, betrayed in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend, I was beginning to realize one terrifying truth. Maybe Daniel had never chosen me because I was ordinary at all. That was the lie I had believed for my entire life. The lie that I was ordinary. The lie that I came from nothing. The lie that I had no history worth knowing. For 31 years, I had lived inside that story without ever questioning it. Until 3:47 that afternoon. I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the clock on the hospital wall for nearly an hour, watching each minute crawl by like a countdown to the collapse of everything I had left. I was trying not to cry, trying not to panic, trying to calculate through medication haze and fear whether my nearly maxed out personal credit card could somehow cover one more night in cardiac intensive care. Just one more night. One more night attached to machines that kept me alive. One more night before I was transferred out of specialized recovery because my husband had disappeared and my insurance had been stripped away. I lay there, weak and terrified, trying to imagine what came next. What does life look like for a woman whose chest has been cut open, whose heart has barely been repaired, and who has nowhere to go? No husband, no financial security, no family. No answers, only fear. And then there was a knock. 2 soft, deliberate taps against the already open doorframe. It was such an unexpectedly polite sound that, for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I turned my head slowly. Standing in the doorway was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back from a strong face marked by age, discipline, and something deeper. Grief, perhaps. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, the kind of suit that signaled old money, serious power, or both. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance. It was his stillness. He carried himself like someone who had spent decades in rooms where panic was useless. Like someone who had learned long ago how to remain steady while the world around him unraveled. Behind him stood a younger woman, likely in her 30s, dressed in a charcoal blazer and holding a leather portfolio tightly against her chest. Efficient, professional, quiet. An assistant, perhaps, or an associate. Both of them looked completely out of place in my sterile hospital room. And yet, somehow they also looked like they belonged there more than anyone else had all day. "Mrs. Calloway," the older man said. His voice was rich, controlled, and unmistakably East Coast polished. But there was something strange in the way he said my married name. Hesitation. Almost as though the name itself felt wrong to him. "Please forgive the intrusion." He stepped slightly forward. "My name is Henry Prescott." He paused, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "I'm an attorney from Boston." I blinked, confused. Boston. Attorney. Before I could even begin to process that, he said something that shattered whatever fragile understanding I still had of reality. "I have been looking for you for 29 years. For a second, I genuinely thought the pain medication was causing hallucinations. Because nothing about that sentence made sense. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so impossible. "I think," I whispered hoarsely, "you have the wrong room." His expression never changed. "I don't." The certainty in his voice sent chills through me. He walked into the room with measured, careful steps, his expensive shoes making almost no sound against the polished tile floor. He stopped beside my bed, leaving enough respectful distance not to alarm me. And he did something so unexpected, so deeply emotional, that it stole the air from my lungs. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached for my hand. Not the one tangled in 4 tubing. The other one. The free one. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted it. And then he pressed my hand to his forehead. Froze. The gesture felt intimate, ancient, grief-stricken. And when I saw the tear slip from his eye and fall onto the white hospital sheet, I stopped understanding anything at all. "You look exactly like her," he whispered. His voice cracked. "Exactly like your mother." My entire body went still. Mother. Well, that couldn't be right. I didn't know my biological mother. I had spent my life with fragmented foster records and vague statements about abandonment. No one had ever come looking for me. No one had ever suggested there was more to my story. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to think. I barely knew how to breathe. Every machine around me continued its rhythmic beeping, but the sound seemed distant now, like it belonged to another room entirely. "Mrs. Calloway." "Claire," he said gently, correcting himself as though my married identity was somehow secondary to something much older. "I understand that you've just endured major surgery, and this is likely the worst possible moment for such an introduction." His voice was compassionate but urgent. "But 40 minutes ago, the hospital administrator informed my office that you were about to be removed from cardiac care due to an immediate lapse in financial coverage." I stared at him, unable to form words. He released my hand carefully, as though it were something precious. "Before we discuss anything else," he said firmly, "please understand this." His silver eyes locked onto mine. "You are not being transferred." My breath caught. "You are not financially responsible for another cent of your care." I blinked, stunned. "My firm has already settled the hospital's outstanding balance in full." My lips parted but no sound came out. He continued, his voice unwavering. $400,000 has been wired this afternoon to cover your surgery, recovery, rehabilitation, private nursing, and legal protection. Legal protection. I couldn't process it. I genuinely couldn't. Because just hours earlier, I had been preparing to lose everything. And now a stranger from Boston was standing at my bedside, paying nearly $500,000 for my survival. And speaking about my mother as though she had mattered. As though I had mattered. For the first time since waking up after surgery, my fear was replaced by something else. Something larger. Something terrifying. A realization that my life, my entire identity, may have been built on a lie far bigger than my husband's betrayal. "I have already paid your bill in full," Mr. Prescott said calmly. His voice was steady, controlled, and impossible to doubt. "Every dollar." He paused, making sure I understood every word. Past, present, and projected. I stared at him, barely breathing. "You are not going anywhere." The room felt suspended in time. My monitors continued their quiet rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. But everything else, the fear, the panic, the humiliation of being abandoned, seemed to freeze beneath the weight of what he had just said. My throat felt dry and tight. "I don't understand." Because I truly didn't. Nothing about this made sense. Just hours ago, I had been a forgotten patient with cancelled insurance, a missing husband, and no way to pay for the surgery that had saved my life. Now, an elegant stranger from Boston was standing beside my hospital bed, speaking like my future had already been reclaimed. Mr. Prescott released my hand gently, with surprising care. The younger woman beside him stepped forward. Without speaking, she opened the leather portfolio she had been carrying. Inside were neatly organized documents. Legal papers, photographs, records. But it was the photo she carefully removed first that changed everything. She handed it to Mr. Prescott, who then turned it so I could see. My breath caught instantly. The photograph showed a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. She had dark auburn hair that caught sunlight like burnished copper. Her gray eyes were bright, alive, and filled with laughter. She was smiling directly at the camera, radiant and beautiful in a way that felt painfully familiar. In her lap sat a small child, a little girl no older than 2. Round cheeks, soft auburn curls, wide gray eyes. My face. I stopped breathing altogether. The child was me. "This," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I stared at the image. No, that wasn't possible." "Your birth name," Mr. Prescott said carefully, his tone shifting into something both legal and deeply personal, "is Claire Elizabeth Whitfield Ashford." The words hit me like another surgery. Not Calloway. Not Whitfield. Ashford. I looked at him in complete disbelief. "Your mother was Margaret Ashford," he continued. His voice softened slightly. "The only daughter of Edmund Ashford III. The name meant nothing to me. Yet somehow it also felt enormous. Like hearing the first crack in the foundation of your entire identity. "You were taken from the site of a fatal car accident outside Manchester, New Hampshire, during the winter of 1997. I felt the blood drain from my face. You were 2 years old." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the blanket instinctively. "The official state record listed you as deceased." He paused, allowing the horrifying reality to settle. "Your car seat was discovered 20 feet from the wreckage. Me. Covered in blood." My pulse pounded violently in my throat. I couldn't process the image. Wreck. Blood. A missing child. Me. "We now know," he said, "that a passing motorist found you alive and severely injured. My entire body had gone cold. He transported you to a small rural hospital 3 counties away." The younger woman quietly handed him another document. "Because of the chaos, your identity was never correctly established." His words felt surreal. "You were admitted under temporary emergency designation as Jane Doe." Jane Doe. Not Claire. Not daughter. Not heir. Just unidentified. "From there," he said, "you entered state custody." His voice carried a quiet bitterness now. "And because no one connected you to the Ashford accident, you disappeared into the foster care system." I stared at him, numb. "Claire Whitfield," he explained gently, "was simply the name placed on your emergency room bracelet the night you were admitted. The name I had carried my whole life. The name I thought was mine. Had been assigned by strangers in an emergency room. I suddenly felt as though my entire existence had been built on paperwork errors and tragedy. The hospital room began spinning slowly. I could hear my heartbeat quickening on the monitor. I could feel it hammering in my chest, the same chest that had just been cut open and repaired. I swallowed hard, desperate to steady myself. What about? My voice broke. My parents. Mr. Prescott's face changed. For the first time, his professional composure gave way to visible grief. Your mother died at the scene. Closed my eyes. A pain I had never known suddenly became real. Not imagined. Not abstract. Real. Your father, he continued quietly, was my closest friend. I opened my eyes again. And for the first time this was no longer just legal business to him. This was personal. He spent every remaining year of his life searching for you. My lips parted, but no words came. He refused to believe you were dead. Tears burned my eyes. Private investigators. Appeals. DNA registries. Legal challenges. He pursued every possible lead. My entire body shook. He died last spring, Mr. Prescott said softly, still believing his daughter was alive somewhere. A tear slid down my cheek. And then another. I had spent my life believing no one had ever come for me. But my father had spent his life searching for me. He amended his will repeatedly, Mr. Prescott said. The Ashford family estate was placed into protected trust, to remain untouched until either you were found, or your death was legally confirmed. His silver eyes locked onto mine. We found you, Claire. The words felt impossible. How? I whispered. Mr. Prescott exchanged a brief glance with his assistant. 3 weeks ago, he said carefully, a DNA sample taken from a discarded coffee cup outside your Portland apartment produced a positive familial match. Froze. 3 weeks ago. My mind raced. 3 weeks ago. That was when everything changed. That was when my unexplained symptoms suddenly worsened. Chest pain. The weakness. Daniel. 3 weeks ago, I repeated faintly. My voice barely existed. Yes. I looked at him, and for the first time, something dark passed behind his expression. Shadow. A realization. The kind of look worn by powerful men who already suspect a terrible truth before it's formally confirmed. And in that moment, he knew. He already feared what Dr. Reyes was coming to tell me. That my heart failure may not have been natural. That my sudden illness may have begun precisely when someone learned who I really was. Claire, Mr. Prescott said carefully, his voice lowering, there is something else you need to understand. My body tensed. The trust established by your grandfather. He paused. His next words changed my life forever. Is currently valued at approximately $412 million. Silence. Complete silence. Even the machines seemed distant. 412 million. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. I was an orphan. Public school teacher. A woman whose husband had just abandoned her in intensive care. And somehow, I was also the missing heir to one of the wealthiest private family fortunes in New England. In one single day, I had gone from discarded wife to survivor, to the sole living heir of a dynasty I had never even known existed. You are its sole heir. Mr. Prescott's voice was calm, but the weight of his words was enough to split my life into two separate realities. $412 million. I just stared at him. Not because I didn't hear him, but because my mind simply could not process what those words meant. $412 million. I had spent most of my adult life budgeting grocery trips down to the dollar. Clipped coupons. I worked extra tutoring hours during summer break. I worried about student loan payments and mortgage interest rates. And now, this man was telling me I was the sole heir to a fortune so massive it felt fictional. But oddly, the money itself wasn't the first thing my mind latched onto. It wasn't luxury, or wealth, or power. It was tea. Lemon ginger tea. Every night for 6 months. The warm mug Daniel handed me with loving hands. The gentle smile. The forehead kiss. The soft reassurances. "Drink this, Claire. It'll help." And suddenly, somewhere deep inside me, in that quiet, instinctive place that perhaps had once belonged to my real mother, something shifted, something cold, something sharp, something terrifyingly clear. It was like the final piece of a horrifying puzzle sliding perfectly into place. Daniel hadn't just abandoned me. Daniel may have been trying to kill me. Not emotionally, not financially, physically, deliberately. My body went cold despite the hospital blankets. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply understood. And understanding was somehow worse. An hour later, Dr. Reyes entered my room. I had already begun to dread his arrival. He was a small, composed man in his 50s with kind brown eyes and the exhausted patience of someone who had spent his life delivering painful truths as gently as possible. He quietly closed the hospital door behind him before sitting down beside my bed. That small gesture told me everything. This was not a routine checkup. This was not standard recovery information. Mr. Prescott remained near the window, silent and watchful, his expression unreadable. His assistant had stepped outside, leaving the room heavy with privacy and inevitability. "Claire," Dr. Reyes said softly. His voice was careful, measured. "The toxicology report from your admission came back this morning." Felt my pulse quicken. He folded his hands together before continuing. "It showed elevated levels of a toxic compound called oleandrin in your bloodstream." I blinked. The word meant nothing to me. At least, not yet. "It is derived from the oleander plant," he explained. My fingers tightened around the blanket. In repeated small doses, oleandrin can cause fatigue, nausea, dizziness, and irregular heartbeat. Every symptom. Every single one. He continued, his voice steady but grave. "In larger cumulative doses over time, it can cause severe cardiac damage, including direct weakening of the heart muscle itself." I felt like I was sinking, like the hospital bed beneath me had disappeared entirely. Dr. Reyes looked at me with visible compassion. "Based on the damage we observed during surgery," he said carefully, "my best medical estimate is that you have been ingesting this toxin consistently for approximately 4 to 6 months. 4 to 6 months. My mind raced backward instantly. 6 months ago. That's when Daniel started insisting I was overworked. That's when he began making me tea every night. That's when my symptoms began. I swallowed hard, my voice barely functioning. "Is it?" I struggled to finish the sentence. "Is it found in food?" Dr. Reyes hesitated just slightly. Then he answered with devastating precision. "It dissolves very easily in warm liquids." My breath caught. Broth. I couldn't move. "It has a naturally bitter taste," he continued. "But that bitterness can be easily masked with honey, lemon, ginger, or citrus." Lemon, ginger, honey. My favorite bedtime tea. The room became painfully silent. I slowly nodded once. Not because I was okay, but because there was nothing left to misunderstand. Above me, I stared at the water stain on the ceiling I had spent the past week absent-mindedly studying during recovery. It looked vaguely like a rabbit. Funny, the strange things your brain notices when it's trying to survive unbearable truths. I kept staring at it now because looking anywhere else meant fully facing reality. My husband had likely spent half a year poisoning me. Slowly, patiently, lovingly. The irony was so monstrous it almost felt unreal. But I was done doubting myself, done making excuses, done being fragile. "Doctor," I said quietly. My voice was calm. "To come. I would like the police to come today." Dr. Reyes nodded gently. "Before I'm discharged." He glanced briefly toward Mr. Prescott. Mr. Prescott gave one single nod. The kind of nod that suggested things were already in motion far beyond what I could yet see. Dr. Reyes looked back at me. "They're already on their way, Mrs. Calloway." I blinked. He continued softly. "By law, hospitals are required to report suspected poisoning cases immediately." I exhaled slowly. The detective should be here within the hour. Not if, when. I turned my head toward the rain-streaked hospital window. Outside, Portland's familiar gray drizzle had begun falling again. Steady, cold. The exact kind of rain that had fallen on my wedding day 4 years earlier. I remembered standing beneath a borrowed umbrella in my ivory dress while Daniel smiled at me like I was his entire world. I remembered his hands holding mine, his lips brushing mine, his voice warm and full of devotion. "You're the only family I'll ever need." Closed my eyes, and for the first time I understood something devastating. He may have meant it. Because once he knew what I truly was, once he discovered I was worth $412 million, family may have become the obstacle. My recovery, unsurprisingly, did not take 2 weeks. Took 12 long, painful weeks of cardiac rehabilitation, legal interviews, physical therapy, forensic investigations, and learning how to exist in a world where nearly every truth I had trusted had been poisoned. My body healed far faster than my mind did. Because surgery repaired my heart muscle. But betrayal required something far more difficult. It required rebuilding an entirely new life from the ruins of the old one. I need to be honest about something. Real recovery does not happen the way movies pretend it does. There was no dramatic moment where I opened my eyes, discovered the truth, and instantly became strong enough to conquer everything. That is not how survival works. When your chest has literally been cut open, your heart repaired by human hands, and your entire life shattered in the process. Healing is slow, painfully slow, sometimes humiliatingly slow. For me, the first 3 weeks were not about revenge, inheritance, or legal battles. They were about breathing. That's it. Breathing without feeling like my ribs were splitting apart. Every inhale felt sharp. Every cough felt catastrophic. Even laughing, on the rare occasions I could manage it, was agony. My sternum had been surgically cracked open and wired back together. There is no graceful way to recover from that. I learned quickly that even the simplest human actions become monumental after major cardiac surgery. Rolling over in bed, standing up, showering, lifting a glass of water. Everything required effort. Everything hurt. For those first weeks, I measured progress in tiny victories. 1 full breath without wincing. A short walk to the bathroom. Sleeping for more than 2 hours without pain medication. I wasn't rebuilding my fortune. I was rebuilding my body. The next 4 weeks were about movement. Learning to walk hospital corridors without trembling. Learning to trust that my repaired heart would keep beating. Learning that weakness did not mean failure. There were days my hands shook from exhaustion after walking 50 feet. Days I cried in private because my own body felt foreign to me. Days when the betrayal hurt worse than the surgery. Because physical pain can be treated. But emotional devastation sits differently. It lingers. And then came cardiac rehabilitation. More weeks. 3 mornings every week. Structured exercises. Monitored heart rates, physical therapy, patience, humility. My therapist's name was Denise. Denise was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, no-nonsense, and utterly unimpressed by wealth, status, or family dynasties. By the time I met her, Henry Prescott had already secured my inheritance, stabilized my legal affairs, and arranged for my transfer to one of the most exclusive private rehabilitation facilities in Oregon, nestled in the quiet hills above Lake Oswego. The place was beautiful. Private suites, state-of-the-art cardiac care, round-the-clock specialists, security personnel, lake views. But Denise did not care that I was technically worth over $400 million. To Denise, I was simply another recovering heart patient who needed to do her squats properly. She cared about posture, hydration, breathing techniques, proper form. She corrected me constantly. "Again, Claire. Slow down. Your heart's healing, but your muscles need work too. Drink your water." And honestly, I needed that. Because in a world that had suddenly become surreal, Denise reminded me that some things were still simple. You survive one day at a time. One breath. One step. One squat. Henry. He insisted I call him Henry after the first week. Had personally arranged my transfer to that private facility the moment I was medically stable enough to leave Portland General. First, I thought it was generosity, protection, perhaps guilt on behalf of the family I never knew. But the truth was more urgent than that. He moved me because Daniel did not know I was still alive. That fact became one of our greatest advantages. Because Daniel hadn't simply left me. He had executed a plan. Careful one. Cruel one. The night before my surgery, while I believed my husband was securing finances to save my life, he went home. He redirected hospital billing calls to a disposable burner phone. He informed the billing office that his wife, me, was no longer his responsibility. He canceled my insurance. He emptied our joint savings account. Every cent. $84,000. And then he disappeared. Not alone. He fled Portland with a woman named Vanessa Bryce. I will never forget the first time I heard her name. Vanessa Bryce. 34 years old. Commercial real estate executive. Sophisticated. Educated. Attractive. And according to the private investigator Henry hired less than 24 hours after we met, she had been having an affair with my husband for 19 months. 19 months. Nearly half our marriage. While I was grading art projects. While I was believing in us. While I was slowly being poisoned. Daniel had built an entirely separate life. And the most horrifying part. He believed his plan had worked. He thought I was dead. Or at the very least as good as dead. His strategy had been horrifyingly precise. By canceling my insurance and draining our resources, he expected the hospital to transfer me to an underfunded county facility during my most vulnerable stage of recovery. And for someone suffering from prolonged oleandrin poisoning, reduced care could easily have meant fatal complications. Infection, cardiac failure, organ stress, quiet, plausible, convenient, a tragic widowmaker story. No murder weapon, no dramatic violence. Just a medical complication. He had nearly designed the perfect crime. But Daniel made one mistake. He didn't know who I really was. And he certainly didn't know that Henry Prescott had found me before his plan could finish unfolding. He didn't know Henry had immediately brought in one of the nation's top private cardiologists from Massachusetts General Hospital. A specialist with no bureaucratic delays. No insurance limitations. No excuses. He didn't know that this physician ordered every advanced test available, including the toxicology screening, the test that identified oleandrin, the test that transformed my mysterious heart failure into attempted homicide, the test that named Daniel's weapon. And once a weapon has a name, so does a crime. For the first time since my collapse, Daniel was no longer my husband in the eyes of the law. He was a suspect. And while I spent my mornings relearning how to walk, federal investigators, forensic accountants, and private attorneys began quietly dismantling the life he thought he had stolen. There was one detail Daniel never knew. And if he had known it, he might have realized just how spectacularly foolish his entire plan really was. 3 weeks before my surgery, around the exact same time my symptoms became dangerously severe, my grandfather's estate had officially entered probate proceedings in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. That legal filing changed everything. Because under the original terms of the Ashford Family Trust, my inheritance was not simple marital property. It was protected legacy wealth. Old money wealth. The kind wrapped in generations of legal safeguards, succession structures, and contingency clauses designed by people who had spent centuries protecting fortunes from opportunists, including opportunistic spouses. And here was Daniel's fatal misunderstanding. Even if I had died, he would not have inherited the trust. Not 1 cent. I had never updated my personal will after our marriage, which meant that under the Ashford Trust's default succession provisions, if I died without children, the entire estate would bypass my husband completely and transfer instead to a distant Ashford blood relative, a second cousin living quietly in Connecticut. Daniel had been poisoning me for money that legally could never become his. Let that sink in. For months, he had carefully orchestrated betrayal, fraud, and attempted murder. All for a fortune he fundamentally did not understand. Because Daniel was not some criminal genius. He wasn't a financial mastermind. He wasn't a strategic predator. He was, in the end, exactly what Henry later called him. A small, vain, profoundly stupid man with an inflated ego and too much confidence. Personally, I had my own less charitable descriptions. Daniel was the kind of mediocre man who listened to too many true crime podcasts, learned just enough legal jargon to feel dangerous, and convinced himself he was brilliant. He believed he was executing an elegant, invisible scheme. But in reality, he was a shallow narcissist fumbling through crimes he barely understood. And once that truth fully sank in, something inside me changed. My fear began evolving into something colder, more strategic. I learned all of this during my first week at the rehabilitation facility above Lake Oswego. I remember the exact moment clearly. It was early morning, gray and quiet, with Oregon fog hanging low over the hills. I was sitting on a white wooden porch swing wrapped in a thick wool blanket, still physically fragile, my sternum aching faintly with every shift in posture. The facility was peaceful, almost absurdly so, considering my life had become an international inheritance battle crossed with attempted homicide. Birdsong, pine trees, fresh mountain air. Me. A newly discovered heiress recovering from poisoning while reading forensic reports about my husband. Life can be surreal like that. In my hands was a ceramic mug filled with plain hot water. Nutty. I still couldn't do tea. Even the smell of lemon or ginger turned my stomach. Trauma rewires simple things. Across from me sat Henry, perfectly composed as always, dressed in one of his impeccable wool coats despite the mild weather. In his lap was a thick legal folder. On the front, written in black permanent marker, were 2 words. Daniel Calloway. Seeing my husband's name reduced to an investigative file was strangely satisfying. Henry spent the next hour reading aloud. Bank transfers, insurance cancellations, fare timelines, travel records, financial fraud indicators, burner phone purchases, Vanessa Bryce. Every sentence peeled another layer off the illusion of my marriage. And oddly, with each revelation I became calmer, not because it hurt less, but because confusion was finally being replaced by clarity. By the time Henry finished, the rain had started lightly tapping against the porch roof. I sat in silence for a long while. No tears, no breakdown, just thought, cold focused thought. Finally I looked at him. "Henry," I said quietly. He lowered the folder. "Yes, Claire." I took a slow breath. How long would it take to obtain Vanessa Bryce's professional licensing records? Her mortgage details, her bank statements, and her complete social media history going back 3 years. For the first time since we met, Henry smiled. A real smile. Warm. Slightly impressed. Perhaps even proud. "My dear," he said smoothly, "I already have them." And that was the moment I realized something important. I was not merely recovering. I was being educated. What followed over the next several weeks was unlike anything I had ever imagined. While my body healed, Henry introduced me to the true machinery of wealth, law, and power. Not flashy billionaire nonsense. Not yachts and tabloids. Real power. Asset structures. Corporate influence. Board memberships. Trust law. Private equity. Political relationships. For the first time in my life, I began to understand what it meant to belong to one of New England's oldest financial dynasties. The Ashford Trust wasn't just money sitting in accounts. It was infrastructure. It was legacy. It was influence woven into industries I had never even considered. 47 publicly traded companies. Commercial real estate portfolios. Shipping interests. Medical technology. Private banking. Insurance. And that last one nearly made me laugh out loud when Henry explained it. "Claire," he said one afternoon, reviewing corporate holdings over rehabilitation lunch, "the trust currently holds a 41% majority stake in Sentinel Coastal Insurance." I blinked. Sentinel Coastal. Henry nodded. Yes. I stared at him. Then the absurdity hit me all at once. Sentinel Coastal Insurance. The exact insurance company Daniel had contacted to cancel my life-saving policy. The same company that had approved my transfer out of critical care after my husband abandoned me. I burst out laughing. Real laughter. Painful post-surgery laughter that made my chest ache. 'Cause somehow, my idiot husband had attempted to weaponize an insurance company that I effectively owned. Henry, to his credit, actually chuckled. And in that moment, for the first time since my world fell apart, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not just survival. Not just anger. Power. Because Daniel thought he had chosen a vulnerable woman with no family, no history, and no defense. What he had actually done was declare war on the wrong heiress. Over the months that followed, I learned more about my real family than I had learned about myself in the previous 31 years combined. Some truths were staggering. Others were heartbreakingly beautiful. And some were so deeply personal that they made me grieve for a life I never had the chance to remember. For example, I learned that my grandfather, Edmund Ashford III, had served on the board of Massachusetts General Hospital for 22 years. 22 years. That explained why, less than 18 hours after my identity was legally confirmed, one of the nation's top private cardiologists had been flown directly to my bedside. At the time, I had thought it was extraordinary generosity. Now I understood it was family infrastructure. Legacy. The kind of old institutional power that quietly opens doors before most people even realize they exist. I also learned something that struck me far deeper than legal documents or corporate holdings ever could. My mother painted watercolors. Just like I did. Not professionally. Not for money. But because she loved it. Because she found beauty in softness, in color, in fleeting moments captured on paper. Henry showed me 3 of her paintings hanging in the private dining room of the Ashford family estate in Back Bay. The first time I saw them I couldn't speak. They weren't just technically beautiful. They felt familiar. The brushwork. The delicate layering. The subtle attention to light. I stood there staring at those paintings with tears in my eyes, realizing that a part of me I had always believed was uniquely mine had actually been inherited. Art hadn't simply been my career. It had been my bloodline. That realization changed something profound inside me. Because for the first time I understood that despite everything I had lost, some essential part of who I was had survived anyway. And perhaps the most important lesson I learned was this. The life I had built before discovering the Ashford fortune was not insignificant. For a while I struggled with that. It would have been easy to look backward and see my former life as lesser. The small Portland rental apartment with the leaky kitchen faucet. The aging 2009 Subaru with rust spreading across the rear quarter panel. My modest teacher's salary. My years teaching third-grade art classes, carefully budgeting supplies and organizing student exhibitions in elementary school hallways. By billionaire standards, perhaps it looks small. But it wasn't small. Not really. It was a meaningful life built by a woman who believed she had nothing, and still created beauty anyway. I had loved children. I had taught creativity. I had worked hard. I had survived. I had built joy from very little. That was not failure. That was strength. And of everything from my old identity, that was the one part one refused to discard. Claire Calloway may have been a lie in name, but the woman I became was real. And she mattered. As for Daniel, I never called him. Not once. I never texted. Never emailed. Never confronted him emotionally. Nothing. 8 weeks into my recovery, he finally left 2 voicemails. 2 pathetic, carefully vague messages. In them, he claimed he had needed time. That he wanted to talk about our future. Our future. As though he hadn't poisoned me. As though he hadn't stolen our money, fled with his mistress, and left me to die. I listened to both voicemails once, then archived them as evidence, and said nothing. Because silence can be more powerful than rage. I let him believe, for as long as strategically possible, that his wife was fading away in some underfunded county ward. I let uncertainty eat at him, I let fear do what guilt never could. I let silence become its own weapon. Meanwhile, I moved to Boston. With Henry's guidance, I officially took possession of the Ashford townhouse. To call it a townhouse hardly does it justice. It was a historic Back Bay residence, elegant, sprawling, steeped in family history, and filled with reminders that I had belonged somewhere all along. There I met my 3 great-aunts, 3 formidable Ashford women in their 70s and 80s, each possessing sharp wit, impeccable posture, and zero hesitation in emotionally overwhelming me within moments of meeting. They cried when they saw me. All 3 of them. One touched my face and whispered, "Margaret's eyes." Another laughed through tears and informed me I had my grandfather's stubborn chin. The third immediately began planning what she called a proper family reintroduction. For the first time in my life, had family, real family, and not one of them had stopped hoping I existed. At the same time, I hired one of Boston's top criminal defense attorneys. Not for myself, for strategy. Because Henry believed, correctly, that understanding the legal defenses Daniel might attempt would be crucial in dismantling them before he ever saw trial. I resumed cardiac rehabilitation, this time at a private facility overlooking the Charles River. Each day I grew stronger. And with each passing week, I also reclaimed parts of myself Daniel had quietly manipulated. I stopped dyeing my hair blonde. For years, I had kept it lighter because Daniel once casually remarked that blondes look warmer. Such a small comment. Such an easy thing to dismiss. But now I understood how control often begins, in subtle preferences disguised as affection. So I let my natural dark auburn hair return. The same rich color as my mother's. The same color I saw in those watercolor portraits. And for the first time when I looked in the mirror, I recognized myself. Then came the investigation. Oleandrin, as it turns out, is not invisible. It is detectable, traceable. And poison, unlike lies, leaves evidence. Working alongside Henry and Detective Morales from the Portland Police Bureau, we began systematically building the criminal case. Detective Morales obtained a warrant to search our former Portland home. What they found was devastatingly clear. Hidden in the back corner of the garage was a coffee can filled with dried oleander leaves. Oleander, a toxic ornamental plant, one not native to Oregon, which immediately raised questions. Questions that digital records answered quickly. Someone had purchased oleander plant material online. Someone had paid using a credit card. And that card belonged to Daniel. Specifically, a card he had foolishly opened years earlier in his own name to finance a used motorcycle. A forgotten account. One he likely assumed no one would think to examine. But financial arrogance is often criminal arrogance. And that single oversight told investigators everything. Purchase dates, shipping records, supplier information, intent. Suddenly, what Daniel believed had been a careful, invisible poisoning plot was transforming into something prosecutors love most. A clearly documented chain of evidence. He hadn't committed the perfect crime. He had left behind a paper trail. And paper trails, unlike poison tea, do not disappear quietly. The evidence against Daniel became overwhelming faster than even I expected. What he had imagined was a careful, invisible murder plan was, in reality, a sloppy series of digital breadcrumbs. And once investigators began following them, everything unraveled. The purchase records alone were devastating. Daniel had ordered dried oleander products, the source of the poison, starting 7 months before my cardiac collapse. 7 months. That timeline mattered, because it proved premeditation. This wasn't panic. This wasn't impulsive violence. This wasn't negligence. This was planning. Structured, deliberate, repeated planning. The orders continued every 2 weeks. By clockwork. Small enough to avoid obvious suspicion. Regular enough to maintain toxicity in my system. And chillingly consistent until just 8 days before my emergency surgery. Days. In other words, he continued poisoning me until my heart was already close enough to failure that nature, or medical crisis, would likely finish what he started. To prosecutors, that pattern wasn't circumstantial. It was a blueprint. Detective Morales and his team then examined our home laptop. Daniel, despite all his arrogance, had failed to properly erase it. That oversight may have been one of the prosecution's greatest gifts. The search history was horrifying. I won't repeat the exact search terms. Some things don't deserve additional oxygen. But according to the district attorney, the browser history effectively read like a step-by-step guide to covert poisoning, cardiac distress timelines, toxic plant lethality, inheritance rights, and spousal medical liability. One prosecutor later described it as a roadmap to criminal intent. That phrase stayed with me. 'Cause it was true. Daniel hadn't simply wanted me gone. He had researched how to make my death appear medically plausible. And Vanessa Bryce was more cautious, more polished, but not nearly as intelligent as she believed herself to be. She had never directly purchased poison, never used her own financial accounts for suspicious transactions, never handled the physical logistics, likely because she assumed emotional distance would shield her legally. What Vanessa underestimated was digital intimacy. Her text messages became her downfall. After Daniel's arrest, investigators lawfully seized his phone. Through subpoenaed communications, thousands of messages were recovered, and buried within them were enough coded conversations to establish conspiracy. References to the problem, when it's done, her family money we haven't found yet, future planning, real estate aspirations, financial speculation, even celebration. Vanessa may not have mixed poison herself, but she clearly understood what was happening, and she stood to benefit. That was enough. She was formally charged with criminal conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to attempted murder. Their arrests took place on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Cattle, a luxury condo, purchased using stolen funds from our emptied joint savings account. And perhaps most astonishingly, Daniel bought it under his real name. No shell companies, no aliases, no meaningful operational security. Because he genuinely believed no one was looking for him. That level of narcissism is difficult to overstate. He thought I was dead. Or dying. He thought he had won. I watched the arrest footage later. Not immediately. I needed time before I was emotionally prepared. But when I finally did, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not grief. Not even satisfaction. Clarity. Daniel looked small. Not physically necessarily, but spiritually. He stood there in the condo doorway wearing expensive casual clothes purchased with stolen money, blinking in visible confusion as armed officers read him his rights. He looked frightened, disoriented, almost insulted that consequences had arrived at his door. And for the first time, I truly saw him for what he was. Not a mastermind, not a monster, not some grand manipulator. Just a weak man who had built his life on vanity, greed, and the assumption that the woman he discarded would never stand up again. He had never imagined I would survive. Never imagined I would recover. Never imagined I would discover who I truly was. And certainly never imagined I would fight back. His trial was scheduled for October. But before October came September. And September brought something far more personal. The charity gala. Oddly enough, when I think back on everything that happened, the poisoning, the betrayal, the inheritance, the arrests, the gala remains one of the most important moments of my life. Not because it was the most dramatic, though it certainly had its moments, and not because it was the most legally significant. It wasn't, but because it marks something far deeper. It was the first time since waking up in that hospital bed that I truly felt like myself again. Not Daniel's wife. Not a victim. Not merely an heiress. Myself. Months earlier, Henry had gently warned me that eventually I would need to make my public debut as an Ashford. The Family Foundation hosted an annual fundraiser every year at the iconic Boston Public Library. Its purpose was pediatric cardiac research, a cause deeply personal to the Ashford family. My grandfather had established the initiative the year after my mother's death. I later learned why. Before she died, Margaret Ashford had been a pediatric nurse. She had dedicated her life to children with fragile hearts. And after losing both his daughter and granddaughter, or so he believed, my grandfather turned grief into legacy. That realization alone nearly brought me to tears. Without ever knowing it, I had become an elementary art teacher, while my mother had once dedicated herself to healing children. Different path, same instinct. Creation. Protection. The foundation board had been waiting eagerly to meet me. Boston society had been buzzing for months. And the press. They had been waiting even longer. The lost Ashford heir had become irresistible media fascination. I knew attending would be enormous. Publicly, personally, emotionally. But I agreed. I agreed to appear. I agreed to formally reclaim my place. And perhaps most importantly, I agreed to give the welcome address. My first speech. My first public statement. My first moment standing fully in both my past and future. But before preparations were finalized, I asked Henry for one specific favor. Just one. Invite Sentinel Coastal Insurance, I told him. Henry raised an eyebrow. The executive team smiled. Yes, I said calmly. All of them. 'Cause sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't private justice. Sometimes, it arrives wearing couture, standing at a podium, reclaiming a family legacy, while the very corporation that nearly let you die watches from the front row. I would like to formally present the commissioning of the new Pediatric Cardiac Research Wing in Sentinel Coastal's name, I told Henry calmly. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, his expression unreadable in that precise Boston way of his. After all, I continued smoothly, they have been generously doing business with my family for many years. I smiled when I said it, not because it was amusing, but because strategy often works best when it sounds like gratitude. Henry, to his everlasting credit, did not ask why. He did not question me. He did not lecture me about restraint or public optics. He simply gave one of those subtle, approving nods that had become his trademark and said, "Very good, Claire." Then he sent the invitations. Every executive, every board member, every senior claims officer, every important name associated with Sentinel Coastal Insurance. Yes, that included Denise Bryce. Denise Bryce, as fate, or perhaps justice would have it, was the older sister of Vanessa Bryce. Unlike her younger sister's polished real estate career, Denise had climbed the corporate ladder inside Sentinel Coastal, eventually becoming Senior Vice President of Claims Administration. Prestigious title. Powerful. Respected. And, unfortunately for her, traceable. Because Denise Bryce's signature was on the emergency cancellation approval form that terminated my insurance coverage the day before my open heart surgery. I had obtained a copy of that form 2 months earlier. I had studied it more times than I care to admit. Her signature was neat, confident, routine. Just another administrative decision on paper. Except this one had nearly killed me. Now, to be fair, whether Denise fully understood the criminal conspiracy involving her sister and Daniel remained legally uncertain at that point. But what was certain was that she had used extraordinary executive discretion to approve an unusually rapid cancellation under suspicious circumstances. And public scrutiny has a remarkable way of motivating corporate accountability. So when September arrived, I was ready. That evening, I stood on the grand marble steps of the Boston Public Library beneath towering chandeliers and vaulted Renaissance ceilings, preparing to make my first public appearance as Claire Ashford. The symbolism was almost overwhelming. I wore a dark green silk gown. Elegant, understated, powerful. One of my great-aunts had helped me choose it after insisting that an Ashford woman must always look like she belongs exactly where she stands. The dress had a high neckline that concealed the long surgical scar running down my chest. That was intentional, not because I was ashamed of it, but because that scar was mine. Private. Reminder. Not a spectacle. My hair, now fully restored to its natural deep auburn, was pinned carefully in the same graceful style worn in my mother's portrait hanging in the Ashford townhouse upstairs hall. That detail nearly undid me when I first saw my reflection. For the first time in my life, I didn't look like Daniel's wife. I didn't look like an abandoned schoolteacher. I looked like Margaret Ashford's daughter. And somehow, I also looked like myself. The room was breathtaking. More than 400 guests filled the historic hall. Philanthropists, medical researchers, corporate executives, political figures, Boston Society, Foundation board members, journalists, and, of course, Sentinel Coastal's leadership team. I saw them immediately. A polished table near the front. Denise Bryce seated prominently among them, elegant in navy silk, professionally composed, utterly unaware of what was coming. Henry stood quietly to my left, solid, steady, protective. Behind me stood the Ashford Foundation Board. Generations of legacy. Generations of institutional power. And there I was, once a foster child who thought she came from nowhere, standing at the center of it all. When I stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. Not polite silence. Anticipatory silence. The kind that exists when people know history may be unfolding in front of them. I lifted my champagne glass. And I began. My speech was gracious, warm, measured. Everything an Ashford public debut was expected to be. I thanked the guests. I thanked the physicians who had advanced pediatric cardiac care. I thanked the foundation trustees, the researchers, the donors, and my family. I thanked individuals by name, one after another, with polished precision. And then, I turned my attention to Sentinel Coastal. I smiled directly at their executive table. "Tonight," I said, my voice clear and elegant through the grand hall, "I would like to extend special gratitude to Sentinel Coastal Insurance." Pause just long enough. For their 43 years of partnership with the Ashford family. Applause followed. Warm. Automatic. Corporate smiles appeared around the Sentinel table. Denise even nodded. But I wasn't finished. Because true power, I had learned, is not in raising your voice. It's in controlling the room so completely that people don't realize the floor has disappeared beneath them until it's too late. I smiled warmly from the podium. Elegant. Gracious. Every lesson my great-aunts had drilled into me about public poise was serving me beautifully in that moment. Then I said the words I had been waiting months to say. I would also like to offer my personal thanks to Ms. Denise Bryce. The room remained attentive, polite, still unsuspecting, for her years of leadership in claims administration. From across the grand hall, I watched Denise immediately straighten in her chair. First she smiled. The practiced corporate smile of a woman accustomed to public acknowledgement. But then, something shifted. Subtle at first. Her posture tightened. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Because smart people recognize danger before others do. And in that instant, Denise Bryce began to realize this wasn't ordinary praise. She was being singled out. Publicly. In front of Boston's most powerful philanthropic, legal, and corporate circles. I held her gaze for just one breath longer than necessary. Not enough to appear hostile. Just enough to make the message unmistakable. Her smile stiffened, then froze entirely. I watched the color slowly drain from her face. And I knew. She understood. Or at least she was beginning to. Because seated before her was not some forgotten policyholder. Not an expendable insurance claimant. Not the woman whose emergency coverage she had personally approved for cancellation in writing the day before life-saving surgery. Whoa. Standing at that podium was Claire Elizabeth Ashford. Sole heir to the Ashford Trust. Majority shareholder. And one of the most powerful new controlling interests her corporation had ever faced. In simpler terms, Denise Bryce was realizing in real time that the woman she had nearly helped destroy now had the legal authority to dismantle her career. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Then I continued. "Tonight," I said, my voice smooth and clear beneath the library's soaring ceilings, It is my profound honor to announce that the Ashford Foundation will officially commission the creation of a new pediatric cardiac research and treatment wing at Massachusetts General Hospital. The room erupted in applause. Genuine applause. Medical leaders stood. Board members beamed. Philanthropists nodded approvingly. This was legacy work. Meaningful work. The kind of announcement my grandfather would have treasured. And I meant every word of it. Because despite everything, this wasn't just revenge. This was reclamation. My mother had been a pediatric nurse. I had nearly died from cardiac trauma. Children with fragile hearts deserved better futures. That wing mattered. But then, I delivered the second announcement. The one no one except Henry and I knew was coming. I set my champagne glass down carefully, folded my notes, and looked directly at the audience. As part of our family's continued commitment to ethical stewardship. Pause. The Ashford Trust will also be exercising its shareholder authority, effective immediately, to initiate a full restructuring of Sentinel Coastal Insurance's executive claims division. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind so complete you could hear crystal glasses being lowered. Then came the ripple. Confusion. Whispers. I continued before anyone could recover. A formal press release will be distributed tomorrow morning. I could practically feel the panic spreading through Sentinel's executive table. Additionally, an independent ethics audit of claims practices will commence Monday. There it was. Not scandal. Not accusation. Not emotional retaliation. Corporate governance. The cleanest knife in the world. No screaming. No chaos. No loss of composure. Just power. Structured. Legal. Immediate. Across the room, Denise Bryce looked as though the marble floor had vanished beneath her feet. Because now she understood fully. This wasn't a speech. This was a public corporate execution. And she had walked into it wearing designer heels and expecting a fundraiser. She left before dessert. Quietly. Through a side exit. No statement. No networking. No farewell. She simply disappeared. At the time, Denise still didn't know the full extent of what was coming. She did not yet know her sister, Vanessa Bryce, had already been arrested months earlier. She did not yet know federal evidence tied Vanessa directly to Daniel's poisoning conspiracy. She did not yet know that in just 3 weeks, courtroom proceedings would expose everything publicly. And most importantly, she did not yet realize that once Vanessa's name became national news, journalists would inevitably connect the Bryce family to Sentinel Coastal's emergency cancellation decisions. Once that happened, the story would no longer be limited to attempted murder. It would become corporate scandal, insurance ethics, executive misconduct, conflict of interest, potential fraud. The press would devour it. And they did. For 6 months, reporters pursued every thread, every signature, every policy override, every family connection, every suspicious approval process. Sentinel Coastal became synonymous not with stability, but with negligence, corruption, and one catastrophic failure to recognize who they were sacrificing. And as I stood there beneath the chandeliers, listening to the room buzz with astonishment, I felt something I hadn't felt since before my marriage began unraveling. Not anger. Not vengeance. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to what had been done to me. I was shaping what came next. Daniel had tried to erase me quietly, but instead, he had forced the return of a woman powerful enough to rewrite the ending entirely. By November, the legal system had finally done what my broken marriage never could. It told the truth. Daniel Calloway was convicted of attempted murder in the first degree. Not negligence. Not reckless endangerment. Not financial misconduct. Attempted murder. The court recognized exactly what he had done. He had systematically poisoned his wife over a period of months, manipulated medical systems, committed fraud, and intentionally created conditions designed to ensure my death. The sentence was 24 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. 24 years. For a man who once thought he was orchestrating a flawless, invisible crime. The irony was extraordinary. Vanessa Bryce's conviction followed in January. Conspiracy to commit murder. 15 years. Her carefully curated life, commercial real estate, polished appearances, expensive condos, strategic affairs, collapsed under the weight of text messages, financial motives, and legal reality. And Denise Bryce. Her downfall became something even larger. By March, separate investigations had uncovered deeply troubling patterns within Sentinel Coastal's claims division. Denise was indicted for insurance fraud and obstruction of justice related not only to my case, but to 3 additional terminated policies over the previous 4 years. 3 vulnerable patients, 3 suspicious cancellations, 3 deaths in underfunded county care facilities. Whether greed, negligence, or something darker motivated those cases remained under active investigation. But the pattern was undeniable. What nearly killed me had not been an isolated bureaucratic anomaly. It was part of something systemic. That realization only strengthened my resolve. People often ask if I attended Daniel's sentencing. The answer is no. I thought about it for weeks. Part of me wanted to look him in the eyes one final time. To let him see that I had survived, that I was stronger, that he had failed. But ultimately, I realized something important. My healing did not require his witness. My victory did not require his validation. So instead I sent Henry, perfectly composed as always, tailored suit, measured posture, and in his jacket pocket, a single folded letter from me. The judge read it aloud into the official court record. I won't share every word. Some things remain private. But I will share the closing lines. Because they were, in many ways, the final truth of our marriage. I was a woman you married for what you thought you could take from her. You took from me my trust, my health, and almost my life. You did not take from me the capacity to build something better without you. That was not yours to take. When Henry later told me there had been absolute silence in the courtroom afterward, I believed him. Because some truths do not need embellishment. They simply land. The morning my letter was read in court, I was not in Oregon. I was standing on the balcony of the Ashford townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue. It was early morning. The first snowfall of the season had begun drifting gently over Boston's historic brownstones. Quiet, clean. I wore a black cashmere coat. Elegant, warm, protective. And in my hand was a cup of coffee. Coffee. Nutty. Not yet. Perhaps never again. Some associations are too costly to reclaim. Below, Henry waited by the car. Because that morning, while Daniel was being formally sentenced for trying to destroy my life, I had somewhere far more important to be. We were heading to Massachusetts General Hospital to break ground on the new pediatric and cardiac research wing. My wing. My mother's legacy. My grandfather's vision. And perhaps most importantly, the answer. As snow fell quietly around me, I thought about the woman I had been just weeks before my collapse. The elementary school art teacher. The woman driving an old Subaru with rust along the rear panel. The woman fixing leaky faucets in a small rental apartment. The woman who accepted warm mugs of lemon ginger tea from her husband every night, believing that gesture meant devotion. For a long time, I had struggled not to judge her harshly, not to call her naive, not to resent her trust. But standing there, looking back with clearer eyes, I understood something essential. She was not stupid. She was trusting. And there is a profound difference between the two. Trust is not weakness. It is not foolishness. It is not failure. The fault lies with those who weaponize it. That distinction mattered. Because I did not want to erase the woman I had once been. I wanted to honor her, protect her, build for her. And so I made myself a promise. I would create something meaningful from what nearly destroyed me. I would help build hospital systems where women like me, women whose symptoms are dismissed, whose abuse is hidden behind domestic normalcy, whose health is endangered by people claiming to love them, would be seen immediately, believed immediately, tested thoroughly, protected financially. I wanted toxicology panels ordered without hesitation. Insurance protections shielded from manipulation. Emergency care that did not depend on wealth, luck, or whether some powerful stranger happened to discover your identity in time. Because survival should not require inheritance. It should require humanity. And I knew somehow my mother would have wanted that. Margaret Ashford had been a nurse, healer, protector. I was her daughter. And now, finally, I had the means to continue that work in a way neither of us could have imagined. So as the snow continued falling over Boston, I stood there, 31 years old, heart scar hidden beneath cashmere, body healing, mind sharpened, name reclaimed, and I thought, I am Claire Elizabeth Ashford. I am alive. I survived. Then I set down my coffee, walked downstairs, got into the car, and went to work. The groundbreaking ceremony took place beneath a pale winter sky, with cameras flashing, reporters gathering, and Boston's medical, legal, and philanthropic elite standing shoulder to shoulder on the frozen earth where the new Ashford Cardiac and Family Advocacy Wing would soon rise. I stood at the podium in a camel wool coat, leather gloves folded neatly in my hands, my dark auburn hair brushing softly against my shoulders in the cold breeze. Behind me was the future. Steel beams, architectural renderings, construction crews waiting. And ahead of me, rows of people expecting a speech about legacy, generosity, and institutional progress. They expected an heiress, philanthropist, a survivor. And yes, I was all of those things. But when I stepped forward and looked out over that crowd, I knew my final words would not be about wealth. They would be about truth. I leaned into the microphone. My name is Claire Elizabeth Ashford. I began, my voice steady and clear. And 6 months ago, I nearly died because the person I trusted most believed my life was worth less than what he thought he could gain from my death. The crowd fell silent. Not polite silence. Human silence. The kind that happens when people stop performing and start listening. I stand here today not because justice arrived quickly, I continued. Not because systems worked perfectly. Not because wealth protected me from the beginning. Pause. I stand here because I survived long enough for the truth to be found. Even now, years later, I remember how still the air felt in that moment. I was lucky, I said. And luck should never determine who lives long enough to be believed. That line would later appear in newspapers around the world. But in that moment, it wasn't written for headlines. It was written for every woman who had ever doubted herself in an emergency room. Every patient whose symptoms were minimized. Every spouse financially trapped by someone dangerous. Every person whose trust had been used against them. This wing, I said, turning slightly toward the renderings behind me, will not simply treat hearts. It will protect them. I announced the creation of the Margaret Ashford Initiative for Domestic Medical Safeguarding, a first-of-its-kind national program integrating toxicology screenings, domestic abuse intervention protocols, legal aid access, emergency insurance review protections, and trauma-informed cardiac care for vulnerable patients. The initiative would be fully funded by the Ashford Trust. Permanently. No board vote could dismantle it. No future executive could quietly cut it. It would outlive me. That mattered. Because I was no longer interested in revenge alone. Revenge ends. Systems endure. And I intended to build systems. Over the following years, that single wing became a national model. Hospitals across the country began adopting similar protocols. Legislators cited my case during insurance reform debates. Medical schools taught the Ashford Protocol in emergency medicine ethics courses. Women wrote to me from every state. Thousands of them. Some shared stories of survival. Some shared stories of loss. Some simply wrote one sentence. Because of your story, they tested me. And those words meant more than every dollar I inherited. As for Sentinel Coastal Insurance, the company underwent one of the largest corporate ethics restructurings in industry history. Multiple executives resigned. Denise Bryce was convicted 2 years later on expanded fraud and criminal negligence charges. The company survived, but only after complete systemic reform. and under Ashford oversight, it was transformed into one of the strictest patient protection insurers in the country. The irony was not lost on anyone. A corporation once weaponized against me became one of the strongest institutional shields for others. Vanessa disappeared from public life after prison. Daniel, I am told, attempted appeals. They failed. I never saw him again. And I never wanted to. Because closure, I learned, is not always found in confrontation. Sometimes closure is found in irrelevance. In time I returned to teaching, but differently. Not because I needed income. Not because I had to. But because art had saved me long before money ever did. I established scholarship programs for foster youth pursuing arts and medicine. I funded public school creative therapy programs. And once a month, quietly and without media, I taught watercolor classes to pediatric cardiac patients recovering in the very hospital wing built from the ashes of my old life. Children painting through 4 poles. Tiny hands creating color despite pain. Hope in motion. Sometimes when I watched them paint, I thought of my mother. Of the watercolors hanging in Back Bay. Of the life stolen from us both. And instead of sorrow, I felt continuity. Years later, one little girl recovering from congenital heart surgery handed me a painting after class. It was simple. A woman standing in snow outside a large building, holding a cup in one hand and the sun rising behind her. At the bottom, in uneven childish handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for building this place so hearts can stay." I cried harder over that painting than I had cried during any trial, sentencing, or inheritance revelation. Because in that moment, everything became beautifully simple. I had not merely survived. I had transformed survival into shelter. And perhaps that is the greatest revenge of all. Not destruction. Not punishment. But creation so powerful that your pain becomes the foundation upon which others are protected. So if you ask me now who I am, I will not begin with victimhood. I will not begin with betrayal. And I will not begin with wealth. I am Claire Elizabeth Ashford, daughter, teacher, survivor, builder, a woman whose heart was poisoned, and who chose, instead of letting that poison define her, to build something extraordinary with what remained. And every winter, when the first snow falls over Commonwealth Avenue, I stand on that balcony with my coffee, breathe deeply into the cold air, and remember, they tried to end my story. Instead, they became the first chapter of something far greater.